Welcome to my second presentation of rural rail containers. But firstly, I would like to thank a young upcoming railway photographer, Jake Griemer, for supplying me with this container train shot for my header. In this session, I will delve into the two infamous colonial development legacies that are even today still severely afflicting Australia's land transport network, and an affliction that restricts regional rail's transport relevance to an underwhelming 10% or less of the overall land transport task. In comparison, over in North America, the railroads carry over 40% of that same task. The above photo, taken in southern Australia, shows a railway line being paralleled by the Calder Highway in the state of Victoria. As I have made multiple journeys along this highway, I have observed that it is a rarity to see a freight train. Passenger trains ceased operating decades ago, but the numbers of large trucks, B doubles, B triples, AB triples, and road trains is quite staggering. It's not surprising that the highway's bitumen surface is extremely rough because the road pavement, designed for approximately 8-ton axle loads, takes a hammering from heavy, long, articulated trucks moving along at the standard road speed. This damage is doubly worse during the wetter months, large resultant potholes being just the tip of the iceberg of road reconstruction costs. Over on the railway, in direct contrast, a perfectly good freight alignment constructed up to 21-23-tonne axle load sometimes sees a not too regular grain train, largely during the night hours, and an occasional container train that services just one location. Should we be surprised at this state of affairs? Well, not really. Everybody knows that rail freight transport in the regional areas has been in decline over the past half century or more. Apart from bulk grain freight, nothing much else finds rail to be a convenient mode of transport. It needs to be acknowledged at this point that the road transport industry is not the culprit here, and I have no intention of demonising such, as those hard-working, mainly small enterprises and drivers, doing enormous and various hours within their huge rigs, are filling the void that the poorly configured rail freight mode vacated years ago. Without them, primary and related industries in the inland regions would be devastated, or worse, non-existent. It needs to be acknowledged, however, that the high transport costs in regional Australia are causing a major constraint on development throughout the region, as is the current high cost of energy also doing. So what are those two colonial railways legacies that are at the core of this rail freight transport failure in Australia? Okay, let's do a tour around Australia's railways with this very helpful open railway map. I hope that some or all of you have had a chance to closely study the map. So we zoom in on the Queensland area and we see various ports from Brisbane heading north, Maryborough, Bundaberg, Gladstone, Rockhampton, Mackay and Townsville, up to Cairns. And we see rail lines moving inland and then petering out at a river or a creek or something too expensive to go any further. New South Wales, coming out from the Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong trio. We have lines variously moving inland to certain distances and then stopping. Now, if you zoom in on that map further, you'll see they were further. It got as far as the Darling actually up in north west New South Wales, but of course they've been pared back due to a lack of relevance to the overall transport task. Down in Victoria, once again, lines radiating out from Melbourne, Geelong ports, one from Portland as well, up as far as the Murray River, and basically stopped, although some went over the Murray River into New South Wales a little bit, petered out. Basically been pared back over the years. Not many of them still exist. Once again, transport relevance, bit of a problem. Adelaide, certainly, they went out from Adelaide and a certain distance and then petered out, pared back, of course, over the years. There's also a system on the Eyre Peninsula that basically has been closed down completely now due to poor relevance to the overall transport task. And so over in Western Australia, out of Perth, or the port of Fremantle, also Albany, Esperance, going inland and then just petering out. So basically, our first infamous colonial legacy is that every colony built its own transport infrastructure as if the rest of the country didn't exist. That's a big problem in national networking. And now we come to our second colonial legacy, afflicting our national land transport. I wonder if you've guessed already what it is. So first of all, let's zoom in to the Melbourne area, right through to Port Melbourne as it is now. And there you see, even though it's on a different gauge, that's a different story now. But from back there, from Sandridge through to Flinders Street Station, somewhere over in this area here, was the first railway built in Australia. So prior to the construction of Australia's first railway, an agreement was struck between New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, following advice from the British Colonial Office to avoid breaks of gauge. Now this agreement was to build on the broad gauge or Irish gauge, and then a Scottish engineer persuaded the New South Wales government to build on the European standard gauge. Now there's a bit of popular nonsense here about the Irish versus Scottish, etc. So we'll go into that now. Now, the engineer, the Scottish engineer that arrived in New South Wales after that agreement was struck, he was no doubt cognizant of Brunel's broad gauge Great Western Railway, a broad gauge 7 foot wide, which is a broad gauge on steroids. He was well aware of the difficulties that Brunel's 7 foot gauge experienced on curves, derailments and enormous screeching noises because the wheels axle assembly is one unit. That is, both wheels have to turn at the same rate of rotation, meaning that the wheel slippage on the inner and or outer rail is inevitable. However, brilliant railway engineering has resulted in the development of wheel conicity that alleviates this problem, but more so on the standard gauge rather than on the wider, broader gauges. The geometry here is involved, it's too complex to be explained in this video, so I won't bother doing that. But just having a look at the Sandridge or Port Melbourne to Flinders Street, totally straight. Look at the rest of the rail infrastructure in Melbourne, straight, gentle, large curvature, lots of tangential track, right up through the divide and out into the hinterland. Quite gentle, good railway construction territory. Might have been a slightly different case if we had to try to build Melbourne over here with the Great Divide and all the Southern Alps in the way. Let's go up to Sydney now and have a look here. Well, you can see there's hardly a tangential piece of track. It's all on curves, and even with the Blue Mountain originally there had to be a zigzag railway to get up this hugely steep escarpments. So an entirely different terrain to deal with, and this is what confronted the new engineer that arrived in Sydney. So this Scottish engineer, upon arrival in Sydney, took in the rugged terrain so clearly evident, not only in the Sydney Basin, but also further out into the Blue Mountains. He realised that much construction of highly circuitous routes would be required. He convinced the New South Wales government that the broad gauge was not appropriate for the Sydney and hinterland rail infrastructure. Unfortunately, the Victorian engines to run on the colony's first railway between Sandridge, Port Melbourne and Flinders Street were already on the high seas, and as their boilers sat squarely between the wheels, conversion to standard gauge was impossible. So the infamous break of gauge began in Australia between Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales. Having seen this lack of regard for a uniform gauge, Queensland, eyeing the cheaper narrow mountain gauge of 3'6" began building on that gauge, even though 95% or more of that state is flat or gently undulating territory. Western Australia soon followed suit, and South Australia on the Eyre Peninsula and some places north of Adelaide did the same, resulting in a town called Peterborough hosting a 3-gauge convergence, somewhere in that region there. So here lies the second colonial transport legacy that, combined with the first, has contributed to probably the greatest land transport disaster of any Western civilised nation on this earth. So that's it for this chapter. In my next chapter, now that we know what the problem is and we're zeroed in on it, we can now talk about the great fix for Australia's land transport, principally in its rail network, or lack of network as we would probably appropriately call it now. So I'll see you in the next chapter.